Monsieur le Président,
President, ladies and gentlemen, it is always an honor for me to address the General Assembly of the United Nations. It is also a responsibility. Above all, given the serious and worrying situation in the world, I'm here before you on behalf of France to make a number of appeals. The first is to kindly ask you to do everything at your disposal to implement the historic agreement that was signed in Paris last 12th of December. This agreement was historic because the conference took place at the time when Paris, the capital of France, had been struck by a terrorist attack. This agreement was historic because, for the first time, the international community had come together and agreed to take on a commitment to reduce climate change and to mobilize financing which will allow the most vulnerable countries to make an energy transition. And yet, before you, I say once again that despite the significant nature of this agreement, we have no time to lose. The 2 years that are ending are the hottest years that have been known since records began. It is true that here with the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, we signed an agreement with 175 countries. But everybody here knows that it will only come into force if it is ratified by 55% of countries, representing 55% of greenhouse gas emissions. The United States and China have announced their decision to ratify. That's very important. Nothing would have been possible without the participation and commitment of these two countries, who are among the largest CO2 emitters. France itself will tomorrow inform the United Nations that it has completed its ratification procedure. But I remind you, all of those countries who are members of the United Nations, I would ask to speed up their ratification procedure. I ask this so that everything is completed by the end of the year. COP21 was a conference of decisions. COP22 will take place in Marrakesh, and that should be the conference of solutions. It is a question here of implementing the International Solar Alliance, of fighting desertification, protecting the seas, and also setting a carbon price. But the appeal that I want to make to you here, following this agreement on the climate, is an appeal for Africa. Africa is a continent full of promise, but its development has been impeded by climate change, migration, conflict, war, and terrorism. This continent has a bright future. However, it might also be the continent that is the source for greater insecurity. And that insecurity targets first and foremost Africans themselves. On behalf of France, I'm calling for a 2020 agenda for Africa. This plan should allow all Africans to access electricity. 2/3 of Africans today do not have access to electricity. This is an injustice. But, above all, it is an impediment to sustainable growth in Africa. What is at stake here, therefore, is responding to the needs of 15% of the world's population. What is at stake is permitting Africans to benefit from and to realize their immense potential for development. What is at issue here is reducing displacement of populations, by which I mean migration. Migration destabilizes countries of origin, but also countries of destination. In Paris, therefore, during this conference, I launched an initiative for renewable energy in Africa. 10 donors, and I would like to thank those donors here, committed to donating $10 billion by 2020. France has taken on 20% of that financing, by which I mean 2 billion euros. Europe has decided on an external investment plan, which, again, with the same idea of providing access for Africans to electricity, might provide for 40 billion, and even double that if the member states of the European Union also participate themselves. Here again, I call on all of the countries here present to join with this effort. I'm not calling for solidarity here. This is a mutual investment which will be beneficial for the entire world. I'm calling for that to be realized as quickly as possible. But there will be no development in Africa if that continent's security is not guaranteed. France committed in Mali to upholding its responsibilities. We need to avoid a situation where terrorist organizations can take control of an entire country and can destabilize an entire region. Today, the threat has been stemmed. Mali is refining its territorial integrity. However, other organizations are appearing, Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda. And here again, they are jeopardizing the security of a number of countries in West Africa, in the Sahel, and in the Lake Chad region. Here again, France is present. France is present to support the armies in the countries concerned, to train them, to exchange information with them, and also to support them in their fight against terrorism. This is what we've done with Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Cameroon, and other countries. And we should also continue this action with the United Nations and with the African Union. But let's be clear. The security of Africans has to come also from Africans themselves, if we want to avoid interference from outside. And the call that I'm making for development and for renewable energy is also a call for security for Africans, so that we can equip their armies and give them the means to respond. And so that these African nations can organize themselves in a free and sovereign fashion around their development. The last call that I want to make here, the last appeal, is perhaps the saddest. It concerns Syria. The Syrian tragedy will be seen by history as a disgrace for the international community if we do not end it quickly. Aleppo is today a martyred city, and it will remain in the memory of history as a martyred city. Thousands of children have died in bombing. Whole populations are starving. Humanitarian convoys are being attacked. Chemical weapons are being used. I have one thing to say here. That is enough. As last February, the ceasefire has only held for a few days. It would have ended the day after its announcement. The regime is responsible for its failure. I would say to its foreign supporters that they need to compel the regime's hand to peace. If not, they will also, alongside the regime, bear responsibility for the division and chaos in Syria. The Security Council should meet as soon as possible. It should not be a theatre for fools. In other words, a place where each evades their responsibility. and where some impede the work of the Security Council for, as they put it, reasons to protect a regime that should itself be seeking a solution with us, France has 4 requests. Firstly, that we impose the ceasefire in line with the decisions that have been taken. This is the precondition. Then we need to assure the immediate sending of humanitarian aid to Aleppo and other martyred cities. That is an urgent request. We must also ensure that political negotiations resume along the lines of the transition that was established as long ago as 2012. That's the solution. Finally, we must punish the use of chemical weapons, and that is an issue of justice. If we take these decisions now, if we act, then there will be a solution for Syria, but there'll be more than a solution. There will finally be hope for refugees and displaced persons. There will finally be action that will allow that Syria can maintain its territorial integrity. There will also be an intervention which will mean that Iraq can also be free from the threat of Daesh, which occupies some of its territory now. And finally, if we decide on an action that is effective in combating terrorism, then that will mean that we'll prevent further terrorist attacks around the world. The risk is chaos and division. And that risk exists beyond Syria. It exists in Libya as well. But what we must urgently do is re-establish the state around the government of Prime Minister Sarraj. That is why France is working with its partners and with the United Nations. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to work to prevent those forces from stabilizing the world, in particular terrorists. France will never resign itself, even if it's difficult, especially if it's difficult. That is why it has taken the initiative to contribute to trying to find a solution to the conflict in Israel and Palestine. Of course, nobody can impose a solution on the parties. But here again, resigning ourselves to the status quo is actually taking a risk. It means allowing for settlement to take place once again. It means allowing an unacceptable situation to exist. So the objective then is to meet here by the end of the year, to have a conference so that Israelis and Palestinians can take on the responsibility to negotiate. This same spirit led me and also Chancellor Merkel to attempt to find a solution in Ukraine. It led to the creation of the Normandy format and allowed us to reach an agreement in Minsk. Today we should do everything that we can to make sure that that agreement is implemented. If not, there will be new violence and perhaps even a war. I remind you that this conflict has claimed more than 6,000 victims. I have therefore taken the initiative alongside the Chancellor of Germany to bring together the Russian and Ukrainian presidents in the weeks to come to make progress and to implement the Minsk agreement. We will never abandon that goal. We will never renounce any initiative if we think it can be useful. Ladies and gentlemen, I mentioned terrorism. It threatens all of the countries in the world. We have a long list of all of those who have been struck by terrorism in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Europe, Oceania as well. No country can say that it is immune to the threat of Islamic terrorism, fundamentalism, fanaticism. which has claimed the individuals lost within our societies and radicalized them. No sea and no wall can protect a country from this tragedy, this scourge of terrorist attacks or aggression, however you want to name it. Terrorism prospers from open conflicts that have for too long not been solved. It's brought with it a wave of refugees. It's shaken the international order, the borders that we thought had been established, the law that we thought we could have respected, the collective security that was the very principle of the United Nations. In the face of these dangers, France once again turns to the United Nations. The United Nations have shown their effectiveness with the adoption of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agreement and also the Paris Agreement, what many thought was impossible. The United Nations is also carrying out peacekeeping operations, which have never been as numerous as they are now. However, if we want to eradicate terrorism, if we want to act, then we need to take decisions. We can't just talk about solidarity when a terrorist attack happens to a friendly country. We can't just show compassion to the victims. We need to take on our responsibilities every single time that it is useful. That is what France is doing. Not because it was attacked. As I've said, every country is potentially a terrorist target these days. That's not what I'm talking about. France takes on its responsibilities because it is a permanent member of the Security Council and because its role is not to block, but to act. France does that because it has an idea, a great idea for the world, that it has because of its history, that it has borne with it throughout its history. Liberty, democracy, justice. But also because France puts its policies at the service of a single goal, peace. And because France speaks to all stakeholders, because France is an independent country that respects law, because France has no other enemies than the force of hate and intolerance, who use a religion that they have betrayed to incite fear, because we want to combat populism, which is taking advantage of the disarray to separate, divide, stigmatize, to oppose religions against each other, to play them off against each other. The risk here is a conflict that would be terrible and disastrous for the cohesion of our societies. France is a secular country, but a country which speaks to all religions and which assures freedom of religion in its own country, because France has no other interest than that stability, development, and the future of the planet be guaranteed. That is why France is also committed, as it shows every day, to the United Nations. I would like to commend the President of the General Assembly and all of those who work for the United Nations, beginning with Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General, who for 10 years has worked on behalf of all of us so that we can make progress. That is also why I call on the United Nations and the Security Council in facing the challenges that I've mentioned, in particular the challenge in Syria and the fight against terrorism. That is why I expect that the United Nations also take on its responsibilities. There is a time for every generation and for every person responsible in public life. And the question is, have we taken the decisions that we need to take, or have we not taken them? Here there are countries of different sizes, different levels of development, different sensibilities, different convictions. But we should have only one objective, one single demand that we make of ourselves. The world needs to make sure that it meets its challenges. That's why I make this call to ensure that we can implement the Paris Climate Agreement, the call for Africa, so that all Africans have access to electricity and an adequate level of development, a call for peace in Syria, because that is an urgent situation, and that is why I believe in the United Nations. It's also why, together with France, I bring to you a universal message. I thank you.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale, je tiens à remercier.
On behalf of the